The palace didn't shake when the order was signed. It froze. A single stroke of ink, a folder pressed shut, and one king alone under the crushing weight of centuries, while two small names were quietly lifted out of a destiny they had been born to inherit. Archie and Lilibet were no longer faraway figures resting somewhere down the royal list. Overnight, they had become the beating heart of a ruling that tore duty away from bloodline. Before we step further into what this truly signals for the House of Windsor, tap that subscribe button so nothing slips past you. Charles sat by himself with the document open in front of him, his fingers hovering near the pen as though the slightest gesture might rewrite something bigger than paper. He had studied the language twice, then once more, and each reading seemed to drain a piece of him. The confidential decree, a private royal command issued long before any statement would reach the public, carried a single devastating aim. Archie and Lilibet were to be lifted out of the line of succession, the official ranking of who is eligible to inherit the crown. To the institution, that ranking was not a family diagram. It was the backbone of the monarchy itself. To the king in that moment, it had become a raw wound carrying the names of two grandchildren. Charles signed without hurry. There was no smile, no summoning of anyone to mark the occasion. He shut the folder with a gentleness that resembled mourning, and for a long, heavy heartbeat, his fingers stayed pressed against the cover. The monarch grasped exactly why the ruling was necessary. If ambiguity lingered around the Sussex children's royal standing, generations of future reigns could face endless strain, dispute, and public fracture. And yet he understood the price. Archie was his grandson, Lilibet was his granddaughter. In defending the institution, he had cut into his own bloodline. A senior aide entered only after the bell rang, and even then, the room held its breath. The aide asked nothing. He already understood. Charles issued one order in a low tone. The decree would not yet be made public. It would be sealed, duplicated, and delivered through a restricted internal palace route, the sort used when a document must travel without ripples. The aide took the folder with both hands, and before slipping out, he privately warned another courtier that this decision had been in preparation long before the outside world sensed anything at all. Meghan learned through a private call, and stillness settled in before rage could arrive. She stood frozen, absorbing the last few words, while Harry watched her expression shift. He did not need to ask. The blow had already walked into the room with her. Meghan set the phone down, her face tight with disbelief, while Harry felt the breath leave his chest. This was not a whisper to dismiss. This was not a rumor to challenge. This was a signed act carried out by his own father. That closed folder had changed everything. Charles had drawn his line, but the ache had only started to spread. Archie and Lilibet had become the center of a royal storm they had never asked to enter, and every person tied to them by blood was now forced to reckon with what the decree really meant. Archie and Lilibet were not pacing marble corridors. They were not seated in tense meetings. They were children living far from the ceremonies and iron gates of royal life. Yet their names carried centuries of authority, memory, and expectation. Around them, adults moved like pieces across a board. Harry felt the wound first. Meghan felt the shame. Charles felt the aftermath. Harry sat in silence after the call ended, his hands knotted together, his fury sealed behind a face that looked more shaken than enraged. He knew the line of succession, the formal order deciding who may one day inherit the throne, better than most people outside palace walls cared to admit. It was more than a list. It was a mark of belonging, of duty, of future recognition. Archie and Lilibet had been born into that shadow even while growing up beyond the daily grip of royal life. Their names bore history, though their childhood had been shaped far from the machinery now judging them. Meghan did not erupt at first. She stayed still, letting the news sink through her, and that calm was what frightened Harry more than anything. She grasped exactly why this moment mattered. It was not merely about rank, titles, or archaic palace customs. It signaled to the world that her children's place could be redrawn by strangers, inside chambers they would never enter. Meghan looked at Harry with contained fire, silently asking if his family had been drifting toward this all along. He had no answer strong enough to shield her from what was true. Charles felt the consequence in a different room, distant from the Sussex home but never far from the ache. The king had signed the decree, yet the hush that followed trailed him like a verdict. His advisors had already alerted him through a confidential emotional risk assessment, a private palace evaluation measuring how much fallout a family decision could unleash publicly and behind closed doors. That report had named Archie and Lilibet as the most fragile pressure point across the entire royal divide. It warned that lifting them from the line would gut Harry, harden Meghan, and force the monarchy to shield itself from accusations of coldness. William's name surfaced within those discussions, though never as the one holding the pen. The prince appeared instead as the future king who would eventually inherit the fallout if Charles left uncertainty behind him. William understood that George, Charlotte, and Louis would one day live in the shadow of every unfinished decision. He also understood that Harry would read the decree as betrayal, not shelter. That was the true tragedy. One brother saw safety, the other saw punishment. The damage spread through the family long before it reached the public. Harry carried guilt, knowing his own rupture from the institution had shaped how the palace viewed his children's future. Meghan carried humiliation, knowing Archie and Lilibet had been made into symbols in a war they had never enlisted for. Charles carried the sorrow of a grandfather forced to behave as a monarch first. And beneath all of it, one question grew heavier by the minute. What had unfolded behind palace walls that convinced the king there was no other route? To make sense of the signature, the palace had to look backward, to a single trigger everyone remembered and no one dared name out loud. Every royal crisis has a moment that later gets minimized. For this one, it was not a speech, not an interview, not a front page. It was a private exchange after a balcony appearance, where Harry confronted William about Archie and Lilibet's future visibility, and Charles overheard enough to realize that the delicate line between family and institution had finally shattered. Harry walked into that private room carrying more than frustration. He carried dread. The ceremony had closed. The smiles had faded. The familiar tension inside the family had returned like a storm no one could outrun. He wanted a single thing committed to writing, a firm promise that Archie and Lilibet would keep their royal standing. That standing meant their acknowledged place inside the royal framework, including how the palace would treat their names, status, and public tie to the crown. To Harry, it was protection. To William, it sounded like an ultimatum. William did not offer the answer he was reaching for. The prince stood his ground, his voice even, but the hurt beneath it was piercing. He told Harry that royal placement could not be handed out like a personal guarantee, not when every private promise could later grow into pressure on the crown. William understood why this instant mattered. If Archie and Lilibet were granted written assurance while living outside the institution's daily rules, George, Charlotte, and Louis could someday inherit a monarchy pulled between two directions. The future king saw peril where his brother saw fairness. Harry felt boxed in, and the atmosphere shifted with his voice. He accused William of hiding behind duty because duty was gentler than empathy. The prince refused to retreat. He reminded Harry that the monarchy could not bend every time private grief spilled into public pressure. That was the moment when the exchange stopped resembling two brothers quarreling and began to sound like two rival visions of royal meaning. One man spoke as a father determined to shield his children. The other spoke as a future king committed to guarding the line he would one day inherit. Charles heard enough to feel something snap inside him. The king stood nearby, silent at first, but each word from his sons struck harder than the last. This wasn't an ordinary family argument. This was bloodline turning into constitutional strain, a private confrontation now threatening the stability and rules of the crown. Charles glanced at Harry, then at William, and saw not brothers reaching for reconciliation, but two men standing on opposing sides of a future neither could fully steer. Meghan's earlier note to Harry later became one of the most painful entries in the file. Through a documented private account recorded by a palace aide, it emerged that she had pressed him to secure Archie and Lilibet's future before palace policy solidified beyond repair. Meghan believed hesitation would harden into defeat. Harry believed one direct plea might move the family toward compassion, but that message gave the palace something colder to examine. It made the confrontation look premeditated, urgent, and impossible to overlook. A courtier later inscribed the phrase that would follow Charles into every meeting from then on: the balcony incident. It sounded small, almost trivial, but inside the palace, it became the point from which there could be no return. That single note turned emotion into evidence. It marked the moment Harry's fear, William's resistance, Meghan's warning, and Charles's silence all became strands of a single dangerous question. Could the monarchy afford uncertainty around Archie and Lilibet? No answer arrived that day. It lingered. It followed the king through briefings, private cautions, and tense conversations where every advisor recognized that the family's wound was becoming a royal hazard. And when the family reconvened behind closed doors, the old injury did not heal. It split open wider. The room held no advisors, no cameras, no polished statements, no rehearsed expressions, only Charles, Harry, and the unbearable stillness between a father and a son. Harry entered, expecting a negotiation. The king was waiting with the decree already signed. In that instant, the confrontation was no longer about titles, distance, or exile. It was about blood. Harry walked in with the force of a man determined not to break. He had been called only after the decree was complete, and that single detail transformed everything. A decree meant a formal royal directive, a written act carrying the authority of the monarch, and this one had already removed Archie and Lilibet from the line of succession. Harry understood the line as the official order of who could inherit the throne, but to him now it felt like a family wound written in palace vocabulary. He looked at Charles and realized the meeting had not been arranged to hear his voice. It had been arranged to make him accept the unacceptable. Charles did not raise his tone. That made it worse. The king told Harry that the monarchy could not carry uncertainty into the next reign, not when every unresolved thread could become a future battle for William, George, Charlotte, and Louis. He explained that the crown required clarity because ambiguous royal status could later be wielded as leverage, pressure, or public challenge. Harry took in the words, but he also took in what lay beneath them. His father had already chosen the institution before the children. Charles saw the pain flash across his son's face and still would not move. Harry accused him of punishing Archie and Lilibet for choices they had never made. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from disbelief. He asked Charles how a grandfather could sign away his grandchildren's place and still label it duty. The king absorbed the words like blows. He answered softly, saying the decision had not been born from anger, nor from revenge, but the calmness only made it feel more glacial. Harry wanted flames, a fight, something human enough to strike against. What he found instead was a monarch masking heartbreak behind restraint. Charles then disclosed the warning that had shaped the final ruling. Through a documented private account prepared after the meeting, it was later recorded that William had cautioned him that the succession line must be shielded from future legal or emotional leverage. The prince had not signed the decree, he had not gripped the pen, but his dread for the next reign had entered the room before Harry ever did. Harry stared at his father and understood the truth all at once. This was not a debate. This was a farewell to possibility. He stepped back, wounded by far more than the decree. He had come as a son begging for mercy. He was leaving as a father with nothing recovered. Charles looked at him with a pain he could not fully expose, and for 1 second, both men appeared trapped by the same crown from opposite ends. Then Harry offered the sentence that lingered in the room long after he was gone. You didn't just remove their names, you taught them where they stand. The door closed, but the damage did not. Charles remained with the silence. Harry carried the rejection, and behind both of them, the machinery of monarchy pressed on, with one future king watching every ripple. William did not shout. That made his part in it more forceful. He sat across from Charles with a calm expression and carefully chosen sentences, aware the ruling would wound his brother, enrage Meghan, and mark Archie and Lilibet forever. Still, the prince saw something others refused to say aloud. A monarchy cannot endure if its future can be negotiated from beyond its walls. William knew the room expected fury, but he offered discipline instead. He looked at Charles and spoke like a man already shouldering a crown he had not yet worn. The private strategy meeting was not about revenge. It was about succession stability, the long-term security of the royal order, and the clear passage from one monarch to the next. The prince believed that if Archie and Lilibet remained wrapped in uncertainty, then George, Charlotte, and Louis would one day inherit more than titles. They would inherit conflict, doubt, and a family wound converted into public pressure. Charles listened without interruption. The king watched his eldest son select every word with painstaking care, and that made the moment harder to bear. William was not asking for cruelty. He was asking for clarity. He told Charles that the monarchy could not leave standing a question that might one day be turned against the next reign. The future king understood why Harry would feel betrayed, but he also knew why the crown feared hesitation. In royal life, silence can transform into permission, and permission can transform into a claim. William faltered when Archie and Lilibet's names entered the room. The prince did not treat them as adversaries, and that made his position heavier still. He acknowledged the children had done nothing wrong. But he warned that royal legitimacy, the public conviction that the next monarch's place is clear and accepted, could be eroded if the palace allowed two parallel royal futures to coexist. George, Charlotte, and Louis would stand within the institution. Archie and Lilibet would stand outside it. William believed the line had to mirror that truth before the truth turned into a battlefield. Charles felt the weight shifting before his eyes. The king was still the monarch, but in that room he sensed the future drifting from him and settling onto his son. William spoke with the composure of duty, but his face carried the cost. He knew Harry would hear betrayal in every syllable. He knew Meghan would see punishment. He knew Archie and Lilibet would one day read the decision as rejection. Still, the prince did not step back. Camilla entered the exchange with quiet weight. The queen consort privately urged Charles to act before hesitation weakened the crown, and through a documented palace account, her warning was later described as short but decisive. She told the king that delay would only make the final cut more painful. Camilla sensed the human toll, but she also understood palace survival. If Charles postponed, the decree would look forced. If he moved now, it would look measured. A sealed briefing gave the room its most chilling caution. It stated that ongoing public ambiguity around Archie and Lilibet could one day spawn rival narratives about royal legitimacy, especially if old family pain resurfaced through interviews, legal action, or public campaigns. William read the warning and stayed quiet for a long moment. Charles lowered his gaze to the file. Camilla watched the silence stretch. Everyone in that room understood the same thing. The decree was no longer merely possible. It was becoming inevitable. The palace had made its choice. William had not held the pen, but his fear for the future had guided the hand that did. Charles held the authority. Camilla pressed for timing. The prince carried the burden of what would follow. And once the decree slipped past the inner circle, the first wave of impact rushed toward Harry and Meghan with brutal speed. The news did not arrive like thunder. It arrived through a secure message, cold and exact, stripping away any margin for misreading. Meghan read it once, then again, her expression hardening with every line. Harry stood near her, unable to defend the palace, unable to defend himself, and unable to escape the truth that his children had become the price of a war he had never truly closed. Meghan held the message as though it had burned through her palm. She read the confirmation again, slower this time, because the words were too absolute to swallow in one breath. Archie and Lilibet's removal had already been logged in the private royal file, a restricted palace record used to preserve decisions not yet released to the public. That mattered because once a decision entered that file, it was no longer family talk. It became part of the monarchy's official memory. Meghan grasped the difference instantly. This was not a threat. This was not pressure. This was the new reality. Harry watched her face close, and guilt overtook him before anger could shield him. He understood the decision altered more than status. It altered how history would remember his departure from the monarchy. Because people would not only ask why he left, they would ask what his children lost because of it. Archie and Lilibet were still innocent, still far from the palace machine, yet their names had been pulled into the deepest fight of his life. Harry felt the truth strike hard. The battle he thought he had escaped had followed his children instead. Meghan turned on him with controlled fury. She did not shout, and that made every word sharper. She asked Harry whether his family had been arranging this while pretending a road home still existed. She asked whether Charles had already chosen the crown while offering silence in the shape of hope. Harry tried to answer, but nothing came out strong enough. Meghan saw that weakness, and it wounded her further. To her, the decree was not only political, it was personal. It told her Archie and Lilibet could be judged, discarded, and explained away by a family that barely knew them. Harry cracked quietly, not in public rage, not with the kind of anger the world could reshape into a headline. He lowered his head, drew his hands across his face, and sat with a shame he could not shake. The prince had fought the palace, challenged the palace, walked away from the palace, and yet his children were now carrying the consequence. He understood why Meghan was furious. He understood why Charles had acted, and that was what destroyed him most. He could see every side, but he could rescue no one. A palace contact then delivered the warning that changed the room again. Through a recorded private call, Meghan was told that if the Sussexes contested the decree too quickly, the palace could release it sooner than intended. The contact said the announcement would be framed as constitutional clarity, a public explanation asserting that the royal future had to remain clear and stable. Meghan heard the threat buried in the polite phrasing. If she pushed, the crown would move first. If Harry pushed, the removal of his children would be worldwide news before the family was ready. Harry searched for one last opening and found only one. A final appeal existed, but it did not run through lawyers, advisors, or written arguments. It required a direct conversation with William. Meghan looked at him, still furious, still injured, but quiet enough to let the meaning sink through. Harry would have to face the brother whose warning had shaped the decree. He would have to ask William for mercy after years of collapsed trust. The choice was cruel. Meghan wanted protection. Harry wanted reversal. Archie and Lilibet needed peace. But the only path remaining led back into the heart of the family fracture. For the first time in years, Harry had to face William without lawyers, advisors, or cameras placed between them. Harry and William met without the palace machine around them. No aides took notes, no courtiers waited by the door. For a handful of minutes, they were only brothers again, one carrying the pain of exile, the other carrying the weight of inheritance. Harry asked for mercy. William answered with sorrow, and somewhere between the two of them, the final hope of reversing the decree slipped away. Harry spoke first because silence would have broken him. He told William that Archie and Lilibet should not pay for wounds shaped by adults. The decree had already been signed, but he still believed one brother might reach the other before the damage became public. A decree meant a formal royal command, and this one had lifted the children from the line of succession, the official order determining who may inherit the throne. Harry knew the words. He knew the system. But as a father, he could not accept that family grief had been transformed into royal law. William listened with a tight jaw and stilled hands. The prince did not answer swiftly, because speed would have felt cruel. He told Harry the decision was now bound to the monarchy's future stability, meaning the crown needed a clear passage for every reign that would come after Charles. William said emotion could not reopen a line the palace had already judged dangerous. That answer hurt him too. He was not speaking only as a brother. He was speaking as the future king who would one day have to guard George's place from every shadow left unresolved. Harry studied him and finally understood the fear beneath the firmness. William was not acting from hatred. The prince feared that unsettled royal status around Archie and Lilibet might one day damage George's reign, because every uncertain name, every loose promise, every half-open door could become a public fight. Harry heard the logic, but logic did not ease the pain. He asked whether George's future truly had to be safeguarded by cutting away his own children's place. William flinched because the question landed exactly where the guilt lived. William then admitted what Harry had not expected. Through a private recorded account later preserved by a trusted aide, it emerged that the prince had argued for Archie and Lilibet's dignity to be protected even while backing their removal from succession. He had asked the palace to avoid humiliation, avoid harsh phrasing, and avoid painting the children as blame. William wanted the record adjusted, not their humanity erased. Harry stared at him, wounded by the mercy and the betrayal arriving in the same breath. Harry spoke as a father again, softer this time. He said Archie and Lilibet would grow up one day and understand what had been done. They would see the family tree. They would know their names had been moved. William lowered his eyes, and for a moment, the future king looked less like a ruler and more like a brother caught inside a duty he loathed. He told Harry he knew the decision would ache forever, but that leaving the question open would ache the monarchy forever. The final silence between them said what neither man could shape into speech. Harry had come to ask for reversal. William had come to explain why there would be none. The prince had chosen stability. Harry had chosen his children. Both men left with something shattered, but only one walked away with no appeal left. The meeting closed without a handshake, without anger, without peace. Harry carried the answer back to Meghan. William carried the burden back to Charles. And what had begun in sealed chambers now moved into public view, where the nation would react to a single image that captured everything. By morning, the secret was no longer secret. Britain woke to a headline that felt less like reporting and more like a royal earthquake. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered in stunned silence while broadcasters looped a single sentence over and over. 2 children had been lifted from the line. The monarchy had acted. The public now had to decide how it felt. Harry watched the coverage without speaking. Meghan stood near him, but refused to give the screen her full face, as though turning away could stop the palace from defining Archie and Lilibet in front of the world. The decree had become public through a palace confirmation, a short official statement designed to share a royal decision without emotion. It avoided cutting language, but it left no room for doubt. Archie and Lilibet were no longer part of the line of succession, the official order laying out who may inherit the throne. That mattered because the line was not simply family history. It was the public map of royal belonging. Meghan turned away completely when one broadcaster spoke the children's names. She did not cry. She hardened. Harry remained still, carrying the silence of a father who had already lost the appeal before the world even knew there had been one. The coverage framed the decision as one of the most dramatic succession moves of Charles's reign, because it touched the future of the crown and the deepest wound inside his family at the same time. It was no longer private grief. It was public record. Charles saw the morning papers and briefly closed his eyes. The king had known the announcement would be brutal, but knowing pain is coming does not make it lighter when it arrives. His signature was now being dissected by strangers, debated by commentators, and judged by families at breakfast tables across the country. He had acted to safeguard the monarchy's future stability, but the cost was printed in bold letters for every eye to read. Charles had not only made a royal decision, he had forced the nation to watch a grandfather choose duty over blood. One front page captured the whole shock inside a single image. A major newspaper displayed a stark royal family tree with two names shaded out beneath the headline, "The line is redrawn." The words hit harder than the palace statement because they made the decision feel final, clean, and cold. Archie and Lilibet were not described with long explanations. Their absence did the work. Their names had become the story, and that was what Meghan feared most. Not the decree alone, but the way the world would learn to repeat it. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd swelled slowly through the morning. Some defended Charles, some whispered that the monarchy had gone too far. One woman standing near the gates offered the sentence broadcasters replayed on loop. "It feels like history just chose duty over blood." Her words carried because they voiced what many felt but could not shape. The monarchy had weathered many storms, but this one looked different. It involved children, inheritance, exile, and a family already torn open. Harry finally stepped away from the screen. Meghan followed him, still angry, still protective, still refusing to let the palace claim the final word over her children's worth. Charles remained with the papers in front of him, aware that the crown had gained clarity but lost tenderness. The public shock began to settle, but the emotional verdict was already forming. This was either protection or punishment, depending on where a person stood. And when the noise faded, one truth remained. The decree had not only rewritten the line of succession, it had rewritten the family forever. In the end, there was no victory. Charles held the monarchy steady, but lost another piece of his family. Harry defended his children, yet could not restore what had been removed. Meghan stood firm, but the palace had already closed the door. Archie and Lilibet became symbols of a brutal royal truth. In the House of Windsor, love may soften the heart, but duty writes the record. Charles remained alone after the public statement, and the silence weighed heavier than any applause ever could. The king touched the signed decree once before setting it aside, as though his hand needed to feel the weight of what could never be undone. A decree meant a formal royal order, and this one had given the monarchy institutional clarity, a clean and official structure for the future. But clarity did not feel clean to him. It felt like loss. Charles had protected the crown, but he had also shut a door on Archie and Lilibet. Harry accepted the truth gradually because a father does not surrender pain all at once. He knew the royal chapter for his children had been formally closed, and that knowledge cut deeper than any public insult could. Meghan stood beside him with quiet resolve, unsoftened by the palace's explanation, and unwilling to let rejection become the story her children would carry. She understood what this moment meant. Archie and Lilibet had not chosen exile, interviews, palace battles, or family war, yet their names had paid the price for all of it. William privately admitted the toll in a recorded conversation later preserved by a trusted courtier. The prince acknowledged the decision would haunt the family, even if history one day judged it necessary. He believed the monarchy had to secure the future reigns of himself and George, because any unclear royal status could evolve into a future dispute. Still, William knew protection did not undo pain. The future king had inherited the burden before he had inherited the throne, and the burden now bore two young names. Charles understood the final meaning better than anyone. The monarchy presented the decree as a safeguard, a way to shield the coming generations from confusion, pressure, and public challenge. The king accepted that reasoning because duty demanded it. But duty offered him no comfort when the room emptied. It did not answer Harry's grief. It did not soften Meghan's anger. It did not explain to Archie and Lilibet why the family they came from had lifted them out of a destiny they had never asked for. The final revelation was not political. It was emotional. The decree did not destroy the monarchy. It revealed how the crown endures. It endures by drawing lines when families beg for mercy. It endures by turning private wounds into official records. It endures by asking someone to pay the price, then naming that price stability. Charles preserved the line. William inherited the burden. Harry lost the appeal. Meghan lost the illusion of return. Archie and Lilibet lost a royal future before they were old enough to grasp its weight. This was the moment the crown drew its final boundary. Not with anger, not with noise, but with a single signature that turned family pain into royal history. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.